On the night of July 9th, 1947, a licensed practical nurse named Loretta Jean Sutter reported for the overnight shift at the station hospital of Roswell Army Airfield in the high desert of southeastern New Mexico. She was 26 years old, unmarried, 3 years into a nursing career that had begun in a charity ward in Lubbock, Texas, and would end, though she did not yet know it, in a curtained-off supply room at the rear of the base infirmary. She had worked 4 consecutive night shifts without incident. This one broke the pattern before midnight. She would tell her daughter, 68 years later, that the first sign something was wrong was not an alarm or a shout. It was quiet, too much of it, arriving all at once, the way a held breath fills a room before anyone says why. A duty officer she did not recognize came through the ward doors just after 11 and asked, by name, for Nurse Sutter, not for the nurse on call, for her specifically. She had been at the hospital 11 months. She could count on one hand the officers who knew her name. She followed him down a corridor she had walked 100 times and found it changed. 2 armed guards stood outside a supply room that had, the week before, held nothing but folded linens and a broken autoclave. The door was shut. A sheet had been tacked over the small window in it. The duty officer told her she was needed inside, that she was not to discuss what she saw with anyone, including other medical staff, and that she would be debriefed when it was over. He did not say when it would be over. He did not say what it was. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Loretta went in. What she found on the table, she said, was not what she had been told to expect, though she was never told to expect anything specific, only that a patient inside required a nurse with small hands and a steady temperament, and that she had been chosen for both. The being on the table was, by her later account, just over 4 feet in length, with a domed skull disproportionate to its narrow frame, skin the color of wet ash, and limbs so thin she said her first instinct, professionally trained as she was to look for the injury that would explain a body built like that. There was an injury, a wound along the lower torso, dark and slow bleeding, that 2 men in unmarked coveralls were attempting to dress with gauze meant for a human abdomen and failing. She said the eyes were the part she could not get past, then or ever. Not black, not the flat cinema black that later became shorthand for every account like hers. Dark, yes, but with a depth to them, a wetness, that she described to her daughter as closer to a frightened animal's eyes than anything else she could compare them to. It watched her the entire time she worked. It did not thrash. It did not make a sound she could identify as pain, though she said she understood, watching its chest and the faint tremor along its limbs, that it was in a great deal of it. The room itself, she said, carried a quality she never fully found words for, even 68 years later. The overhead light had been switched off, replaced by 2 portable lamps angled away from the table, leaving most of the work in a grey half-dark that made the instruments on the tray harder to find than they should have been. There was no smell of antiseptic, which struck her immediately as wrong in a room being used for surgery. There was instead a faint mineral scent she could never place, something she once compared, apologetically, to the inside of a struck match. Neither man in coveralls spoke to her by name. When she asked, once, for a second roll of gauze, one of them left and returned with it without a word, and she understood, without being told, that questions beyond the immediate needs of the patient would not be answered that night. The 2 men in coveralls stepped back when she moved to the table, and did not step forward again. She was given no instruction beyond keep it stable, and no equipment beyond what already stood in the room. Half of it wrong for the patient in front of her. She worked for what she believed was close to an hour, though she said afterward she had no real sense of time passing in that room, that the ordinary markers of a shift, the clock on the wall, the sound of the ward beyond the door, seemed to recede the longer she stayed. At some point the being reached for her hand. She let it take hers. She said its grip was light, dry, cooler than a human hand, but not cold, and that it did not let go again for the rest of the time she was in that room. What happened next is the part of Loretta's account her family has spent the better part of a decade trying to understand, and the part I have spent the better part of a year trying to verify against anything else that survives. She said the being did not speak, not with a mouth that moved the way a mouth moves to form words. She said something arrived in her instead, not a voice exactly, closer to a pressure behind the eyes that resolved, after a moment, into something she could understand the way you understand a sentence read to you in a language you did not know you spoke. She used the word wait more than once when she described it. Not loud, heavy. She never gave her daughter the full content of it, not for another 68 years. What she said, that first night, in the only conversation she ever had about it with a fellow nurse before both women were separately warned off the subject, was a single sentence. It told her it was not afraid of dying. It was afraid of being forgotten before anyone understood what it had come to say. She wrote nothing down that night. She had nothing to write with, and she said later she would not have dared regardless. But she remembered a sound, a repeated syllable that came with the pressure behind her eyes, something close to Arveth, and in the weeks that followed, in a spiral notebook she kept hidden inside a hat box at the bottom of her closet, she drew, from memory, a small mark. 2 lines crossing at an angle, with a short hook at the base of the shorter line. She did not know what it meant. She said she drew it because if she did not, she was afraid she would lose it, the way you lose the details of a dream within an hour of waking. The being died at approximately 12:40 in the morning, by Loretta's estimate, since no clock was visible from where she stood, and no one in the room offered her the time. She said the grip on her hand did not loosen gradually. It simply stopped, all at once, the particular stillness that any nurse who has held a dying patient's hand learns to recognize immediately and never forgets. One of the men in coveralls checked for a pulse in a way that told her he did not know where to check. She did not correct him. She was already being walked toward the door. No one in the room spoke for what Loretta remembered as a long stretch of silence after the pulse check failed. One of the men in coveralls stepped out. The other stayed and began, without instruction, to cover the table with a sheet pulled from a supply shelf, the same kind used on ordinary gurneys, an oddly domestic detail she said she thought about more, in later years, than almost anything else from that night. She was not asked to help, and not asked to leave either, not yet. She stood by the door for several minutes, still feeling the last impression of the grip on her hand, the way you can still feel a ring on a finger after you have taken it off. The debriefing happened within the hour, in an office she had never been inside before, conducted by a major whose name her daughter remembers only as Ferris, a detail Loretta repeated consistently enough across the few times she mentioned that night at all that her family has come to trust it, even without a service record to confirm it. She was asked to describe what she had seen. She was asked twice whether the patient had spoken to her. She said no. She has never explained to any of her children why she lied in that room within the hour of it happening, when she would tell the truth, in full, 68 years later, to the same daughter she was protecting with the lie. She was made to sign a document she was not permitted to read in full, only the final page, where her signature was required beneath language she described as very carefully general. She was told the events of that night were now a matter of national security, that discussing them with anyone, including her own family, would be treated as a serious offense, and that her conduct going forward would be watched. She was reassigned 9 days later to a station hospital in Fort Sam Houston, Texas, a transfer her official service record lists without explanation, effective July 18, 1947. Her personnel file, which her granddaughter Diane obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2009, shows a complete entry for her first 11 months at Roswell Army Airfield, detailed enough to log which wards she rotated through and which supervising physician signed off on her competency review in April. Then it shows the transfer order, dated and stamped, with no accompanying explanation of cause, which was standard for other transfers in the same file series. What is not standard is the space in between. The final 2 weeks of her Roswell posting, the exact period that contains the night of July 9th, are simply absent from the file, not redacted, not blacked out, absent, as though that page of the log was never filed at all. What her family finds hardest to reconcile, going back through the file Diane obtained in 2009, is not any single missing page but the speed of everything around it. The transfer order was processed in 9 days, unusually fast for a routine reassignment across state lines, in an era when paperwork of that kind commonly took months. The competency review that should have accompanied any transfer, standard for every other move in her file, does not appear for the Fort Sam Houston posting until nearly 5 months after her arrival there, as though the Army had decided where to send her before it had finished deciding what to say about why. A second nurse on shift with Loretta that same week, a woman named Corinne Aldridge, was transferred out of Roswell the same day to a different post entirely, and the two women, by Susan's account, never spoke again after 1947, despite having been close enough before that summer that Corinne's name appears in Loretta's early letters home. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Loretta was discharged from military nursing service in the spring of 1948 and returned briefly to Lubbock before taking a civilian nursing position in Amarillo, where she met Harold Whitfield, a supply clerk 2 years her senior, and married him in the fall of 1950. Her daughter Susan was born in 1952. By every account her family can offer, Loretta Whitfield became, over the following decades, a woman defined by an almost aggressive ordinariness. She kept a tidy house. She sang in the church choir. She rarely missed a shift in 31 years of civilian nursing, and she developed, somewhere in those early Amarillo years, a small collection of habits that none of her family thought to question until after she was gone. She would not hold hands with strangers, not even the brief, reflexive handshake of an introduction, and would offer her forearm instead, a substitution so smooth and so consistent that Susan did not register it as unusual until she was well into adulthood. She kept a hat box on the highest shelf of her closet that she moved with her through 4 different homes and never once opened in front of her children. She asked, every single time a grandchild was born in the family, the same question before any other, not is the baby healthy, but does the baby have all its fingers? A question Susan found strange for 40 years and never asked her mother to explain. And she was, by the account of every nurse who trained under her in Amarillo, extraordinary in exactly one specific skill. She could hold a dying patient's hand in the final minutes with a stillness that other staff found almost unsettling, as though she had done it before, under circumstances the rest of them could not imagine. One of those nurses, a woman named Ruth Delacroix, who trained under Loretta in the early 1970s, told Susan something in the months following Loretta's death that Susan had never heard before. Ruth said that in the final seconds before a patient passed, she had more than once seen Loretta's lips move slightly, as though she were counting or praying, and that when she asked what her supervisor was saying, Loretta told her it wasn't words, not really, and changed the subject before Ruth could ask what that meant. Ruth assumed at the time it was simply the private ritual of an older nurse who had seen more death than most. She has since come to wonder whether Loretta was listening, every time, for a pressure behind the eyes that never returned. The pattern of what happened to Loretta in that supply room, and what happened to her afterward, is not, according to the small number of researchers who have spent time with cases from the same window of July 1947, an isolated one. A base guard stationed at the same installation that same week, a man named Corporal Walter Dobbs, gave an account decades later, before his death in 1999, in which he described being posted briefly outside a room he was told to guard and not enter, and recalled, without prompting from the researcher who interviewed him, a mark he had seen scratched faintly into the wooden doorframe at hip height. He described it, in a recorded interview his family later shared, as two lines crossing at an angle with a short hook at the base. He had never met Loretta Sutter. He had no access to her notebook, which remained in a hatbox in a series of private homes for the better part of 70 years. He offered the detail unprompted in 1996, describing a symbol he said he had never been able to stop thinking about. A second account, harder to verify but consistent in the specific detail that matters most here, comes from a mortuary technician in Roswell named Glenn Aldous Reyes, who prepared remains for the same facility in the weeks following the incident and who told his son, only once, before his own death in 2003, that one of the bodies he processed had a wound along the lower torso that did not match the official cause listed on the paperwork he was given to file. He used, according to his son, almost the same words Loretta used to describe her patient's eyes, saying they were not the flat black eyes the pictures later made famous, but something with more depth to them, something that looked, in his words, like it had been afraid. A third account, gathered second-hand but consistent in the one detail that matters most, comes from the granddaughter of a base physician named Dr. Emmett Kolarik, who served briefly at Roswell Army Airfield that same July before being reassigned, like Loretta, within weeks. Kolarik never spoke publicly about his service and destroyed his personal papers before his death in 1981, but his granddaughter recalls a single childhood conversation whose significance she did not understand until decades later. Her grandfather describing a patient who died holding the hand of a nurse, and saying, in words she has never forgotten precisely because she did not understand them at the time, that it went easier than it should have because somebody let it. He would not say more. His granddaughter did not learn Loretta Whitfield's name until 2017, when a distant cousin of the Whitfield family mentioned the story at a funeral. Neither woman had any reason to expect the other to attend. Two men who never met each other, working different jobs in different corners of the same base in the same handful of days, independently reported details neither had any documented way of obtaining from the other. A symbol scratched into a doorframe that matches, stroke for stroke, a symbol drawn from memory in a hidden notebook. A description of eyes that carried depth and fear rather than the flat, manufactured blankness popular imagination later assigned to every account of this kind before either man had spoken publicly. A physician's private remark, decades before Loretta's own confession became public, about a nurse who let something go easier than it should have. This is not the shape of a rumor spreading and mutating as it travels. Rumors borrow language. These accounts share specifics that predate the language any of the three men would have needed to borrow it from. What Loretta Whitfield finally told her daughter came in November of 2015 in a hospice room in Amarillo in the last conscious week of her life, at 94 years old. Susan had asked her mother, as she had asked perhaps a dozen times across 4 decades, and never once received an answer, what had actually happened during those 2 missing weeks at Roswell. This time, for reasons Susan still cannot fully explain, her mother answered. She said the sentence that had arrived behind her eyes that night, the one she had carried and never repeated in full, was not a warning, and it was not a confession of alien intent toward the human race, the kind of thing later decades of testimony from other witnesses had led her family to brace for. She said it was smaller than that, and heavier for being small. It told her, in that pressure behind her eyes that resolved into understanding the way a held breath resolves into a sentence, that it had chosen to die where someone would hold its hand rather than somewhere it would die alone, and that it recognized, in the last minutes it had, that this was not owed to it and was grateful regardless. It told her the symbol was not a warning and not a message to be decoded. It was a name, its own, the only part of itself it had time to leave behind. Susan asked her mother, in that hospice room, whether she believed it. Loretta said she had spent 68 years trying not to answer that question because the answer required her to accept that she had held something's hand while it died and had understood it, fully, the way she had never fully understood another human being in the whole of her nursing career. She said the hardest part had never been the secrecy. The hardest part had been going back to work the following week, holding the hands of ordinary dying patients in an ordinary hospital, and finding herself, every single time, listening for a pressure behind her eyes that never came again. Loretta Jean Whitfield died 4 days after that conversation, on November the 9th, 2015, with her daughter Susan holding her hand. Susan has said in the several conversations we have had over the past year that she thought of nothing else in that final hour except the shape of what her mother had described 68 years earlier, an ordinary hand holding another hand across an impossible distance at the exact moment that distance closed for good. She had spent her entire adult life without knowing that her mother's stillness at her deathbed, the specific skill her colleagues found unsettling and could never quite name, had been inherited from a night in a supply room in 1947 that the official record does not admit ever happened. I am not prepared to tell you that a dying visitor from somewhere beyond this world chose, in its final minutes, to be understood rather than examined. I am not prepared to tell you that a symbol scratched into a doorframe by a guard who never met the woman who drew the same mark from memory is proof of anything beyond a strange and stubborn coincidence. What I am prepared to tell you is that the record here, incomplete in exactly the place it would need to be complete to be dismissed, does not behave the way an invented story behaves. Invented stories tend to grow more elaborate with retelling, gathering detail and certainty as they pass from person to person. Loretta Whitfield's account did the opposite. It grew smaller, quieter, and more specific the longer she carried it, shedding drama rather than accumulating it, until what she finally handed her daughter was not a revelation, but a single, plain sentence about a hand that did not let go. I have spent months with this file, with a personnel record that goes quiet for exactly 2 weeks, with a granddaughter's memory of a physician's offhand remark, with a guard's recollection of a mark scratched into a doorframe he was never supposed to look at closely enough to remember. None of it, taken piece by piece, would hold up in a courtroom or a journal, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend otherwise. But taken together, the pieces do not scatter, they align, imperfectly, toward the same quiet center, a room, a hand, a name given away because there was no one else left to give it to. If that sentence is what Loretta Whitfield said it was, then somewhere in a hatbox that passed through 4 homes across 7 decades, a name still exists in graphite, waiting for someone who was never supposed to be able to read it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.